Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Halifax International Security Forum in Nova Scotia, Canada, one of the world's leading gatherings of defense, national security, economics, civil society, and political leaders from around the world. And one of those is Dr. Dov Zakheim, a good friend of mine, former Pentagon comptroller during the Bush administration, longtime national security hand, Bush administration, Reagan administration, I should say, also, and now just an intellect about town.
Flattery will get you everywhere.
That's all right. That's where I thought I'd start on this great morning. Dov, you're a longtime participant in all of these security panels, off-the-record ones, including on-the-record ones like this one is, or combination as it is here in Halifax. What were some of the key takeaways for you? You know, you go and you pay attention and you do try to be very nonpartisan in how you approach all of this stuff. What were the key takeaways from this year's conference?
I guess the biggest one, clearly, is the increased focus on Putin. It seems to grow every year. A sense that Russia is almost the Soviet Union again. And so we've had, of course, panels with the ministers from the Baltic states, Ukraine, but it's not just them. There's a real sense, Russia in the Middle East, Russia even playing in the Korean issue, Russia, of course, in Eastern Europe. So that's number one. Number two, obviously, is North Korea. What are we going to do about it? In fact, there was a semi-scandal, if you will, total misreporting of what General Hyten said. General Hyten is the head of the Strategic Command, who said if he was given an illegal order, he wouldn't follow it. And people have interpreted that to mean that Mr. Trump will give him an illegal order. Well, that's not really what he meant. But it gives you a sense of concern in two different ways. One is concern about North Korea. The other is concern about where the United States is headed. Are we trigger happy? I would just point out to those who are watching that when President Reagan was elected, everybody said we would have World War III. We still haven't had it. I hope we never have it. So there's a need to calm down, but there was a perceptible sense here of nervousness. Nervousness, are we leading? Are we still leading? And one of the messages, of course, was, look at us on the ground in Europe. And we got this from the Eastern European NATO members. America is actually more there than it was before. So, you know, those are some of the big takeaways. China, of course, a concern, but I thought somewhat less so than in the past.
One of the things that you said when we spoke last year was, don't listen to the tweets, look at the actions when it comes to the president. You've always said that there's only one president at a time. At the same time, you've also been critical when you viewed it to be critical and necessary to be critical. A year into it, what's your appraisal? What's your assessment? What are they doing right? What are they doing less right?
The thing that they've done the most right is somehow hang on to General Mattis. Jim Mattis has been able to talk to the president, or rather talk the president out of certain things, whether it's moving the embassy to Jerusalem or what he said about Article 5 in NATO. Clearly, General Mattis brings a degree of gravitas every time he walks into the White House. And that's important. And I think after a year, people recognize that. And they recognize that it's not just Zakheim saying ignore the tweets. They recognize that the tweets are the tweets. But that is not policy. And they're beginning to understand that. The other thing that I think people are beginning to understand is that we really do have separate branches of government. One of the biggest challenges Americans have when they talk to their friends, their allies, even their adversaries, is that the president is not a king, is not an absolute monarch. We have a Congress. They really are a separate branch of government. And people are seeing that. Russia sanctions, for example. Clearly that was a congressional initiative. So between those two, the fact that people have learned that, yes, there may be tweets, but there's also General Mattis, General Kelly, and so on, and the Congress, they're beginning to understand that America hasn't walked away from the world, and that's terribly important.
Are you, I think I understand why, though, as a reporter, what General Hyten said was not extraordinary, but I think that it was heightened because folks have a sense that President Trump is irresponsible. And I would say that, most people would disagree with the characterization of Trump as being a Reagan-ish individual. You and I talked about that at the Reagan Forum.
Right.
Completely different man, two-term
Yes.
governor, serious political intellect,
Yes.
and where people see a marked difference. I thought it was very interesting for some of the people at the Reagan Library when those comparisons were being made last year when we were at the Reagan Forum, how people bristled, at that. But In terms of what they could be doing better, right? You've always talked about the importance of diplomacy. We have Rex Tillerson who's doing some moves that you've criticized in terms of the core importance of it. We've heard General Mattis say, hey, if I didn't have the State Department, a strong State Department, I'd have to be buying more bullets. Talk to us about what the administration could be doing better, and start with that on the foreign on the foreign relations and on the diplomacy side of the equation.
Well, I think the first thing is what you just mentioned. I can understand where Mr. Tillerson is coming from. The State Department still is living, in some ways, in the 19th century. But that's not where you start. You cannot abandon your interactions with your allies, with your friends, partners, even with your adversaries, to the extent that we seem to have done. He seems to be terribly inwardly focused. That's the job of a deputy secretary, quite frankly. The secretary is the CEO of his agency or her agency. The deputy is the chief operating officer. And to some, not even to some extent, to a great extent, Mr. Tillerson appears to be acting like a chief operating officer. It's not his job. And so what you're getting is default to General Mattis on just about everything. That's a problem. That's a problem that General Mattis has identified, because he's right. Diplomacy comes first. If you default to the military, then we wind up doing things that we don't like, that our allies don't like, and that ultimately just don't work out.
You were a key member of the Bush defense team in that first term where Afghanistan was a challenge, and then Iraq. I want to go to Afghanistan, but also get your sense on both of them. First on Afghanistan, you know, the president has stepped up and has a new strategy. Although if you talk to you know, some folks, as we had an opportunity to do here on an off-the-record basis, so I won't mention any names, they said, look, in many respects, the campaign has proven overall to be successful. And so, yeah, it's good to have some more people, but you're basically pushing it over a finish line, given that there's going to have to, you know, Taliban really has been very isolated, even though it controls certain pockets. There's going to be a political reconciliation. So a couple of folks were last night, even when we were talking late, talking about, look, this is going to be a lot like a Northern Ireland reconciliation process that they'll go through. So, you know, they were not as negative, although if you ask a lot of Americans, they're like, oh, you know, that's a disaster, and, you know, let's not shovel more troops or people into it. So first is on Afghanistan. You know, how do you see this unfolding? You know, because there are some other voices, including those who are in uniform, who are like, look, if we couldn't do it with 140,000 troops, there's no way we're going to do it with just 5,000 or 6,000 or even 10,000 more.
Well, we've redefined our objectives. Our initial objective was to clean the place up, to have a real democracy under Karzai, to even get rid of the warlords. I met several of them. I got the impression in those days that they weren't going anywhere. They certainly were not going to take vacations in Florida and stay there. You know,
but there's such a nice property down there.
Not only that, there's no state taxes, and now with the new tax law, maybe they would really, in any event. We changed our objectives. Our objective now is essentially to hold things pretty much as they are, try to push the Taliban back even more, try to further isolate them so that they're incentivized to cut some kind of deal. That's a very different objective when we were, you know, at one point we wanted to get rid of the Taliban. It's not going to happen. Given that more, frankly, from my point of view, realistic objective, sending 3,500 troops makes an awful lot of sense. And it makes sense in two ways. First, because it allows you to really realize that objective, but secondly, because it doesn't send the wrong signal. Everybody looked at what we did in Iraq. President Obama pulled the troops out. Immediately when those troops left, Maliki becomes a much more activist, authoritarian dictator than he already was. I would argue that that's why we had ISIS in the first place. You don't want that to be the impression in Afghanistan. And so by sending more troops, Mr. Trump actually sends multiple signals. We're not leaving, we're committed, and it's not going to be like Iraq. Very, very important.
Let's go to Iraq. ISIS has been defeated. That's a campaign. It's, you know, 3 years. I mean, the battle plan changed very little with the change of administration, fortunately, right? Everybody continued to prosecute it, try to minimize civilian casualties, although there's been greater reporting that, unfortunately, more civilians have died in that campaign. Talk to us a little bit about what the next phase has been. You do a lot of private meetings and discussions with leaders across the region. Talk to us a little bit about what's next there and what U.S. strategy has to be, because Unfortunately, the ISIS guys are a lot like water. They will always find an insidious way to get back into your basement.
Well, that's true, and you're seeing that in Libya. So let's start with Syria itself. I think we've come to the conclusion that we're not going to get rid of Assad anytime soon. The Russians are entrenched there more than they've ever been. I mean, they have 2 long-term leases, not only for naval forces at Tartus, but also for an air base. Never had that before. Got to realize that. I think our objective needs to be push the Iranians out. I don't think we can push the Russians out. I'm not even sure we want to if the Russians somehow, in some way, at some time, come to an understanding with us and turn on the Iranians. And you know the Russians will turn on anybody if it suits them. We've got to break this Iranian Shia arc. King Abdullah was right years ago.
Absolutely.
There is a Shia arc. In fact, there are 2 now, because you could argue that there's a southern one via Yemen.
Right.
If I'm in Saudi Arabia, I am living a nightmare right now. And so how do you break it? How do you wake up and discover the world isn't as bad as you thought it was in your nightmare? You got to do something about Iran. Attacking Iran's not going to happen. The Israelis aren't going to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon, as some people in Riyadh would like to see. But there has to be a concerted effort to push the Iranians out of Syria. So that's objective number 1.
How? How do you do that?
The only way you can do it is in concert with the Russians, in concert with those who are funding the opposition, and frankly, in concert with Assad. Assad has to see that he has more to gain without the Iranians than with them. It's not going to be easy, because they've always, look, his father got a fatwa that he was a Shia thanks to the Iranians, because it's not at all clear that the Alawis are Shia or even Muslim. So he owes them big time. Whatever they give him has to be somehow replaced. Not easy, and frankly, I think it's counterintuitive, and certainly runs against the grain of what a lot of people in Washington think. But we've got to keep in sight what our primary objective is. It's not to kick the Russians out of an air base. It's to kick the Iranians out of the Eastern Mediterranean.
And then you had a second point that I interrupted you when I said, okay, what was your policy prescription?
Well, beyond that, it's to keep Lebanon whole, which is not going to be simple. This is a country that it's almost like a miracle that it keeps surviving. The Iranians, of course, via Hezbollah, want to take it over. Rash actions like going after Hezbollah in Lebanon would actually make things worse. So we've got to figure out how to, again, damage limit in that country. Because as long as you've got a Lebanese armed forces, as long as you've got a Lebanon that's intact and not totally under Hezbollah's control, it means that Lebanon is not totally under Iran's control. So you want to do that. And finally, Iraq. We've got to be much more active, I believe, in getting a reconciliation between the Kurds and Baghdad. If we don't do that, then, frankly, the Iranians win. Because a fractured Iraq is a weak Iraq, which is already pretty weak, and a weak Iraq is just lying there waiting for the Iranians. So those, I would argue, would be our objectives.
And Turkey obviously would become involved in a way that we would rather they not be involved in this situation.
Remember, the Turks are already in Iraq. I mean, for all that we're supposedly a defensive alliance, we have a NATO ally that has planted itself in another country in spite of the demands from that country's prime minister that it get out. And Abadi has said, get out, and they don't listen. I think, personally, we have some issues with the Turks that really need to be resolved. They're a wonderful ally in many ways. I've dealt with them since the early 80s. But right now, I think they're probably as difficult a NATO ally as we've ever had.
And how's the best way to deal with that? Because you're looking at Turkish interests again in Russian triple-digit SAM system. They want it integrated with NATO's system. NATO officials have said this time what they did the last time. Ankara wanted to do that, which is no way, you're not going to do that. What's the right way to be dealing with what is one of the largest countries, it is the largest country in the region?
Well, obviously, you cannot attack Erdogan directly because it's a matter of face. And he's not going to take it, and he's got a nationalistic approach that many Turks like. I mean, Turks in many ways are walking on air again. They kind of like the idea of being the Ottoman Empire all over again. People pay attention to them. So you can't embarrass him, but I think privately we are in a position to pressure him much more than we have, including economically. He made his reputation by essentially revitalizing the Turkish economy. That's how he got to where he got. That is his calling card. We can pressure him, but not publicly. I wouldn't do it publicly.
Two things, because I know you want to get back into one of the panel discussions. Let me ask you about Saudi Arabia. You and I have spoken about that quite a lot. That was a topic of conversation here, particularly with the Middle East contingent. If you ask anybody in the region, the thought of a collapsed Saudi Arabia is sort of the worst possible outcome for the Middle East. One of the Israeli delegation here, sort of likened it to, there are storms and then there are 100-meter tall tsunamis. This is a 100-meter tall tsunami.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about what the stakes are. Salman is doing some necessary reforms. Everybody acknowledges that. The question is how he's going about doing it, and including some of the foreign incursions that he's doing. How do you think he's doing? Do you think he succeeds? And if he doesn't succeed, what are the stakes?
Well, he's doing things internally that Saudis like. I forget if it's 60 or 65% of the Saudi population are under the age of 30. He's 32. He's one of them. They like that. They like what he's done regarding women. It's a big deal to let women drive in Saudi Arabia. It goes against decades of tradition. And Saudis are fundamentally conservative people. But they want to be in the 21st century as well. What he's doing in that regard, what he is doing in terms of his vision for 2030, people like that. The issue for him is what he's doing externally. He's in a war in Yemen that it's a quagmire. And what's amazing is Saudi Arabia was in another war in Yemen with the Egyptians years ago in the 60s. And it was a quagmire for both of them.
Right.
And the reason Yemen is a quagmire is the same reason that you can never conquer Afghanistan. These are mountain people. You're not going to take tanks and just go charging down roads. This isn't the Fulda Gap. They're mountain people. They spend their time shooting at each other until somebody else comes, and then they all get together to shoot at you. So he's stuck in there. He has involved himself in Lebanese politics in a way that I'm not sure was the right way to go. He is terribly worried about his eastern province, which is heavily Shia, and he's right to be worried. His approach, though, and then the fight with Qatar. The Qataris they always play all sides, and they've probably overdone it by supporting the Brotherhood, which drives Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates crazy, drives the Saudis crazy. But to go and tell these guys, essentially give up your sovereignty, it's not going to happen. He has got to figure out a way to step back from that, because there are enough people inside the kingdom that he has alienated. It's not just the intelligence community anymore. It's the National Guard. Whom did he replace? The son of King Abdullah, who basically created the National Guard. Now, the new head of the National Guard, his great-grandfather helped King Abdullah, but he helped King Abdullah. He wasn't King Abdullah. So now you've got the guys with the guns whose careers have been made by somebody else, with a new young commander who really they don't know anything to. You don't tick off the guys with the guns while you've already ticked off the intelligence people.
This is the kind of wisdom you get here and nowhere else. But how? Look, the country depends on 7 families. Yeah. He has now rounded up everybody from the 6 families. You were sort of pointing out what the succession is like in Saudi Arabia, where it continually rotates among those families. What are the chances that he gets overthrown and it end up in a very awkward civil strife situation?
No, I don't think that'll happen. The family is very clever about this. Remember, you've had a king of Saudi Arabia killed. You've had a king of Saudi Arabia who basically belonged in an insane asylum, and they moved him out. They know how to manage this. And so this is not going to be a coup kind of thing and a revolution and all that. The real question in my mind is, when does the family get fed up? When does it get fed up? If it does, he's out. But, people have been predicting that the kingdom's going to fall apart for decades, and it hasn't. And the reason it hasn't is because this very, very large family of princes has figured out how to have a succession without an explosion. frankly, it's kind of brilliant. It may not be the way we like societies to be run, but one of the things we always have to remember, particularly as Americans, is they may like our blue jeans, but they may not like the way we govern ourselves.
Right. Last question, the administration has put a premium on brokering an Arab-Israeli, or I should say Israeli-Palestinian peace accord. Jared Kushner has spent some time over there. You spend some time talking on both sides on a regular basis, who you consider close friends. Where does this go? What's next? Or is it something that is just not on anybody's radar screen, given the condominium Israel now has with Saudis and Emiratis over concerns over Iran, in which the trade-off was, hey, can I just do whatever I want with Palestinians?
Well, first of all, you shouldn't have corrected yourself, because this deal that Jared and I guess whoever else envisages is a deal that involves the Arabs pressuring Abu Mazen, the head of the Palestinian Authority. So you were right. Their vision is an Arab-Israeli deal. Now, what's the problem? Well, the first problem is that Mr. Netanyahu needs the settlers to stay in power.
Right.
And his entire objective in life is to stay in power. And remember, he's under several investigations right now as well.
Right.
He's always managed to avoid whatever it was that people were throwing at him. But to avoid investigations and to lose the settlers, he's finished, and he knows it. So he's got no inclination to do so. Abu Mazen is the inheritor of Arafat. He's had opportunities before, and he's backed away. I don't think either of those gentlemen is going to make a deal. Now, there's one thing that a senior Israeli who's here at the conference said to me, and I won't say who it was, but it's somebody who has pretty good political instincts. He said, maybe, he said, the Trump administration and Mr. Netanyahu are working together to at least get this started, because if this gets started, nobody's going to indict the Prime Minister of Israel while he's in the middle of a peace process. Only an Israeli could have thought of that.
That is brilliant political cynicism, though.
Well, Mr. Netanyahu is a master. We have to remember that. That's why he's the longest-serving Prime Minister of Israel, even longer than Ben-Gurion.
Right.
So I wouldn't rule it out for that reason, because the Israeli who told me this is a politician as well. But it's very hard to see this happening. And I don't think, by the way, that the Saudis will sign up to this once they fully realize that Israel's not going to attack Hezbollah. I think in the Saudi mind was, look, if the Israelis go after Hezbollah and weaken the Iranians, then, maybe we ought to do something too. But if that doesn't happen, what's the incentive for Saudi Arabia?
Dov, always a pleasure. Always love your work, especially national interest and anywhere else you've been writing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.